English, storytelling version. There are nights that pass unnoticed, and then there are nights that echo through eternity. Holy Thursday is one of those nights. It doesn't shout, it doesn't demand attention, but it holds the weight of the Ikaisao, world in silence. As the sun sets on Jerusalem, time seems to slow down. The air is thick with something unspoken, a sacred tension between heaven and earth. It's the eve of a cosmic turning point. There is a room upstairs, candles flickering, on worn stone walls. A table is set, not for a feast, but for a farewell. Bread waits to be broken. Wine waits to be poured. A teacher waits to look into the eyes of his friends for the last time before the storm. This is not just another night. This is the night everything begins. On this night, a loaf of bread becomes a sacrifice, a cup of wine becomes a covenant, a towel becomes a throne, and a kiss becomes the doorway to redemption. The disciples don't know it yet, but history is bending at the table they sit around. And God, the creator of the stars, is about to kneel before them. No lightning, no grand speeches, just a whisper of love spoken in broken bread, spilled wine, wet feet, and a heart ready to be pierced. So let me ask you something. What if you had been there that night? Would you have stayed awake? Would you have followed him into the garden? Would you have let him wash your feet? This isn't just a story from the past, it's a mirror for our present. Because Holy Thursday is not a farewell, it is a beginning. And everything is about to change. The streets of Jerusalem were overflowing. Pilgrims had come from every corner of the land. Families squeezed through narrow alleys. The scent of lamb roasting filled the air. It was the time of Passover, the most sacred feast of the Jewish calendar. Eitzei, remembrance of deliverance, of blood painted on doorposts, of death passing over. But on this particular year, something else was stirring. Something deeper, something eternal. In the midst of the crowd, quietly and without spectacle, Jesus had made arrangements. Not by accident, not by convenience. He had sent 2 disciples ahead to find a room. Not just any room, but one already prepared. A space, reserved for what would become the most sacred supper in history. The man carrying a jar of water was the sign, a subtle instruction, a divine detail. And so the disciples followed him, up a narrow staircase, into a quiet upper room. Simple, unremarkable. But heaven often chooses humble places. This room, this hidden space above the noise, wasn't just shelter from the crowd. It was the stage where eternity would unfold. The table was set. The bread was ready. The wine had been poured. But this was not just a dinner. It was a sacred invitation, not just for those 12 men, but for every soul that would come after. Because what was about to happen wasn't a ceremony. It was covenant, not tradition, but transformation. Not just remembrance, but rebirth. The upper room would become more than a location. It would become a symbol, a meeting place between the divine and the human, a sacred threshold between what was and what could be. Within those 4 walls, Jesus would not only feed his disciples, but feed the world. He knew what was coming. The betrayal, the agony, the cross, and yet he didn't run from it. He walked into it, with open hands and a heart wide open. The details of this night matter. The timing, the preparation, the intentionality. Everything was arranged, because love is never random. And this is the mystery. God prepares sacred moments for us long before we notice them. There are upper rooms in our lives, quiet places in the midst of chaos, invitations we overlook, tables we ignore, and yet they wait, still, holy, patient, for the moment we finally accept. Jesus chose a hidden room to unveil heaven. He chose silence to speak the loudest truth. He chose simplicity to reveal glory, and the invitation still stands. So I ask you, How do we prepare our own hearts for sacred moments? When the room is ready, when the bread is broken, when the teacher calls us by name, will we show up, or will we be too distracted, too hurried, too full to make room? The upper room wasn't just a moment in history, it's a mirror, and it's waiting for you. The room was quiet. Not the silence of awkwardness, but the silence of something wholly approaching. There was a stillness in the air, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The disciples reclined around the table, their eyes moving between the flickering candles and the face of the teacher who had changed everything in their lives. The Passover meal had begun, but it didn't feel like the other years. There was something different tonight. The bread was the same. The wine was familiar. The prayers followed tradition, and yet, something in the atmosphere whispered that this was no ordinary remembrance. Jesus picked up the bread. His hands, calloused from carpentry, scarred from service, held it like something sacred. And then, looking into their eyes, he broke it. Not quickly, but deliberately. The sound of the crust cracking seemed louder than usual, and then came the words that rewrote history. "This is my body, given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." He paused. The room was frozen in time. Then he lifted the cup. "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, poured out for you." The disciples didn't fully understand what was happening, but their hearts knew. It was important. Eternity had entered the room. The old ritual had just been reborn. The bread and wine, once symbols of the past, had become carriers of the future, of a promise sealed not with lamb's blood, but with the blood of the Lamb. This was no longer just a meal. It was the beginning of a divine exchange. What had been human became holy. What was physical became eternal. What was ordinary became sacred. Jesus didn't offer a new doctrine. He offered himself, not in abstract words, but in broken bread, not in sermons, but in shared wine, not in distant heavens, but at a table where hands touched, eyes met, and love became real. This is what makes the Last Supper so revolutionary. It was not just the end of something. It was the birth of something eternal. The Eucharist wasn't meant to be just remembered. It was meant to be experienced. Again and again. In homes, in churches, in quiet corners of the heart. Because that table in the upper room stretched far beyond those four walls. It stretched into every generation. It stretches into yours. And the bread still breaks. The wine still pours. The invitation still stands. In our modern world of noise and speed, we forget how to be still. We forget how to sit at the table. We forget how to let silence speak. But the Eucharist remains. A whisper of heaven in the chaos. Spiritual nourishment in a starved and anxious age. Every time the bread is lifted and the cup is shared, that night returns, not as memory, but as presence. Jesus is not re-crucified. He is re-revealed, in our hands, in our hearts. And the question isn't whether he's still offering himself. The question is whether we're still hungry. Are we still willing to let the sacred interrupt our routines? Are we still willing to taste eternity in what looks like bread? Are we still able to see love poured out in something so small, so fragile, so easily overlooked? That night, the disciples didn't know they were part of something eternal. We do. We've heard the story. We've seen the cross. We know the tomb was empty. So what's stopping us? The table is still set. The cup is still full. The silence still speaks. Do you still taste eternity in what seems ordinary? The meal was nearly over. The candles still flickered, casting soft shadows against the ancient walls. The disciples sat, full from the bread, stirred by the teacher's strange words. There was a tension in the air, something unsaid, something unfinished. And then, without warning, Jesus stood. He took off his outer robe. He wrapped a towel around his waist. He poured water into a basin. The room froze. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if the world had tilted, because in their culture, foot washing wasn't just an act of kindness. It was humiliation. It was reserved for the lowest servant in the household. Dusty roads, sandaled feet, calloused skin stained with the dirt of the day. This wasn't a gesture of honor. It was a job no one wanted. And yet, here was the Son of God, the one who calmed storms, the one who raised the dead, the one who had just said, "This is my body, my blood." Now kneeling, now serving, now doing what no one else dared. One by one, he moved from disciple to disciple, their feet in his hands, his eyes never looking away, water splashing, towel soaking, silence thick. When he came to Peter, the tension finally broke. "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Peter asked, his voice shaking. Jesus answered gently, "You don't understand now, but you will later." Peter pulled back. "No, you will never wash my feet." It was pride. It was discomfort. It was love that couldn't comprehend this kind of closeness. And then Jesus said, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." Silence. Peter's resistance collapsed. Then not just my feet, my hands and my head as well. He didn't want to miss out. But he still didn't fully understand, because this moment wasn't just about hygiene. It was about identity. It was about kingdom values turned upside down. Jesus didn't just teach love. He embodied it. He didn't just preach humility. He knelt into it. He didn't demand service. He became the servant. In one of the most sacred acts ever performed, God bent low. The Word made flesh touched the filth of the world with bare hands, and didn't flinch. The king wore a towel, not a crown, and in that towel was more power than in any throne. When he finished, he stood again and asked, "Do you understand what I have done for you?" They didn't. Not yet. But one day they would. He continued, "If I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. I have given you an example. Not a suggestion, not a metaphor. An example. This was the new model of leadership in the kingdom of God. The first becomes last. The greatest becomes least. The leader becomes the servant of all. No title, no prestige, just a basin, just a towel, just love, expressed in the most ordinary, uncomfortable, and humbling way. It's easy to serve when the cameras are on, when applause follows, when titles affirm. But what about when no one is watching? What about when it's messy? What about when the one you're kneeling before might betray you tomorrow? Jesus didn't skip Judas. He washed his feet too, because real love doesn't wait to be earned. It offers itself, unconditionally, uncomfortably, completely. And now the question falls on us like water into a basin. Do you lead with the towel, or expect the throne? The room was dimly lit, and the warmth of the meal still lingered. But suddenly, the air shifted. Jesus had been quiet for a moment, as if carrying the weight of a hidden grief. Then, his voice broke the stillness. "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." The words dropped like thunder into the silence. Confusion spread across the table. Eyes darted from face to face. No one moved. No one breathed. It wasn't just the accusation. It was the intimacy of it. This wasn't a crowd. This was his inner circle. His brothers. His friends. And yet, one would betray him. One by one they asked, almost whispering, "Lord, is it I?" It wasn't just a question of innocence. It was a reflection of how fragile the heart can be. In that moment, no one was entirely sure of themselves. No one stood on moral high ground. Everyone felt the sting of possibility. But one man didn't ask. Judas already knew. He sat there, quiet, still, a little too still. His hand clutched a piece of bread. His eyes didn't meet the master's. There was something colder in his gaze, something closed off. The plans were already in motion. The price had already been agreed upon. 30 pieces of silver, the cost of a soul. And yet, Jesus didn't name him. He didn't shame him. He didn't cast him out. Instead, he handed him bread, a gesture of intimacy, a symbol of trust. In their culture, to dip the bread and hand it to someone was to honor them, to say, "You are still at my table." That's what love does. It offers itself, even to the one who will betray it. And before this, Jesus had already knelt and washed Judas's feet. The same hands that would soon be kissed in betrayal had just scrubbed the dust from Judas's toes. No hesitation, no exception, no bitterness. Just love. Love that doesn't withdraw. Love that doesn't protect itself. Love that still serves, even when it knows the outcome. This kind of love is terrifying, because it refuses to control. It refuses to retaliate. It simply offers. And that's what Jesus did. He gave Judas every chance. A seat, a meal, a moment, a choice. But love never forces. It only invites. And Judas walked away. But the question we often avoid is this: how many times have we done the same? Judas is not just a character in a story, he's a mirror. He is every heart that once burned bright with faith but slowly went dim with compromise. He is every soul that chooses ambition over surrender. He is every believer who wants Jesus close enough to bless, but not close enough to disrupt. And yet, Jesus still offers the bread to you, to me, to the parts of us that still wrestle with loyalty, to the corners of our hearts where betrayal quietly hides. He still offers, still waits, still hopes, even when we're cold, even when we're halfway out the door, even when we're holding the bread with trembling hands and hearts full of conflict. He looks at us not with condemnation but with compassion, and he asks no questions. He just hands us the bread, the same bread he broke, the same body he would offer, the same love, even for the one who wouldn't return it. That's what makes this moment sacred. Not that betrayal was present, but that love didn't run from it. So now it's your turn to sit at the table, and he places the bread in your hand. The question isn't whether he still loves you. The question is, what would you do with the bread in your hand? There are words you say in passing, and then there are words you say for the very end. In the shadows of that upper room, as the weight of the coming cross grew heavier, Jesus began to speak, not as a preacher on a hillside, not as a miracle worker in a crowd, but as a father giving his last words to his children. These weren't just lessons, they were legacy. First, he spoke of peace. Let not your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. He knew what they would soon face: fear, confusion, abandonment. The hours ahead would shake their faith and scatter their hope. But he offered them something deeper than understanding: trust. Not in the absence of pain, but in his presence through it. I go to prepare a place for you, he said, and I will come back. His first gift was the promise of presence. They would never be alone. Second, he gave a command, not new in wording, but radical in depth. Love one another as I have loved you. Not love when it's easy. Not love when it's safe. Love that serves. Love that forgives. Love that bleeds. He wasn't calling them to sentiment, but to sacrifice. To love as he had just loved them, by kneeling, washing, welcoming, breaking. This wasn't a gentle reminder. It was a revolution. Third, he gave them help for the journey. The Helper, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name. He will teach you all things and remind you of what I said. They wouldn't have to carry this mission alone. They wouldn't have to remember everything perfectly. They wouldn't have to be strong all the time. He would send the Spirit, not just a comforter, but a compass, a guide in a chaotic world, a fire in their bones when fear froze their mouths, a whisper of truth when lies surrounded them, a strength beyond what they could summon. In that moment, Jesus planted what the church would need to survive: peace, love, power. He wasn't just building a religion, He was establishing a family, a movement, a living body that would stretch across time, and all of it was handed down in words, simple, spoken in low tones, echoing through hearts more than halls. This was his spiritual testament, not signed in ink, but sealed in blood, not stored in books, but burned into souls. And today, those words still wait to be lived. We often remember them in ceremonies, quote them in sermons, etch them on stained glass. But do we live them? Do we actually believe we're not alone? Do we actually love like he loved? Do we actually listen for the Spirit when the world gets loud? Because legacies aren't proven in memory, they're proven in motion. Jesus didn't just say goodbye, he handed us the keys. So now the question comes, quietly as it did that night, are you living his last words, or merely remembering them? The night had grown colder. The meal was over. The songs had faded. And Jesus walked slowly into the shadows of olive trees, where silence was deep and sacred. Gethsemane, a name that means oil press, a place where olives are crushed to release what's hidden within. Tonight the Son of God would be crushed by sorrow, by dread, by the unbearable weight of what was to come. He brought his 3 closest friends with him, Peter, James, and John, and asked them simply, "Stay here. Keep watch with me." Then he stepped away, alone, utterly alone, and he fell to the ground, not in quiet reflection, but in agony. Sweat fell like drops of blood. The Gospels do not exaggerate. They reveal a Messiah fully human, shaking, weeping, overwhelmed. "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me." Then came the words that tore heaven open. "Yet not my will, but yours be done." This was the real battlefield. The cross was coming, but the victory began here, in a garden, in the dark, in surrender. It wasn't nails that held him to the cross. It was this moment, this prayer, this decision. Back near the edge of the trees, the disciples had fallen asleep. Not once, not twice, 3 times. He had asked for 1 hour, and they couldn't give it. Their eyes were heavy, their spirit willing, but their flesh too weak. And still, Jesus didn't rebuke them harshly. He simply asked, "Could you not watch with me 1 hour?" Not for protection, not for miracles, just presence. He didn't need their strength. He wanted their nearness. That's the heartbreak of Gethsemane. Not just the pain, not just the dread, but the loneliness, the silence from heaven, the absence of friends, the weight of the world shouldered by one. And yet, in that silence, Jesus stood, weakened, yes, but resolute, because something had shifted. The cup wasn't taken away, but it was accepted. The will of God had been embraced, not with ease, but with blood. This garden moment matters, because every soul has a Gethsemane, that space where surrender isn't poetic, it's painful, where obedience doesn't feel victorious, it feels like loss, where the cup we're asked to drink tastes like everything we fear, and we wrestle, we cry, we question, we sweat, we break, but still, we're invited to say, "Not my will, but yours." Gethsemane is where heaven and earth collide, not in glory, but in groaning. It's where trust is tested, where calling is clarified, where faith stops being theory and becomes flesh. And if we dare to enter it, if we dare to kneel in the dark, we find a God who has been there first, a God who doesn't shout orders from afar, but one who knows what it is to tremble, to plead, to surrender. We are not alone in our gardens. We are never the first to sweat through surrender. Because in Gethsemane, Jesus showed us the way. He didn't numb the fear. He walked through it. He didn't demand escape. He chose obedience. He didn't wait to feel strong. He trusted in weakness. So now we return to the trees, to the stillness, to the trembling ground, and we ask ourselves, what cup are you still afraid to drink? The stillness of Gethsemane was broken, not by thunder, but by footsteps. Torchlight flickered between the branches. Steel glinted in the moonlight, and at the front of the crowd stood a familiar face. Judas. He didn't shout. He didn't run. He simply walked forward, with calculated calmness, the kind that only comes when conscience has gone silent. He had arranged a sign. A kiss, the most intimate gesture now twisted into a weapon. "Rabbi," he said softly, and pressed his lips to Jesus' cheek, and Jesus, eyes full of sorrow more than anger, asked the question that pierced deeper than any sword. "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" No outrage, no resistance. Just truth, spoken with heartbreak. The disciples panicked. One of them, Peter, lunged forward with a sword, slicing off the ear of a servant. Chaos erupted, but Jesus stopped it. "Put your sword away," he said. "Those who live by the sword will die by it." And then, the unthinkable. Jesus reached down, touched the man who had come to arrest him, and healed him. One last miracle, one final act of mercy. For an enemy, because that's who he was. Even fighting in the moment of betrayal, he never stopped being love. And then, he surrendered, not as a victim, but as a lamb. Not as someone overpowered, but as someone willing. He didn't flinch. He didn't hide. He stepped forward and said, "I am he." And the crowd, startled by the force of those simple words, drew back and fell to the ground. Even darkness trembled at the presence of light. They bound him like a criminal, dragged him away under the weight of lies. But make no mistake, he wasn't taken. He offered himself. That's the difference. Surrender doesn't always mean defeat. Sometimes it's the highest form of love. He didn't fight because he had already won. In the garden, in the silence, in his yes to the Father's will. We often confuse surrender with weakness. We think laying down means giving up. But Jesus showed us the truth. Real strength is in choosing love when you could choose revenge. Real courage is staying still when fear screams run. Real power is saying yes when everything in you wants to say no. He could have called legions of angels. He could have disappeared. He could have stopped it all. But love stayed. Love stood still. Love gave itself freely. And now, in the flicker of those torches, in the footsteps echoing through the garden, we're left with a question that still speaks to every soul. Do you surrender out of fear or out of faith? The night has long passed. Jerusalem no longer sleeps under Roman rule. The disciples are dust and legend. The table is gone. The room is silent. And yet, something still lingers. Holy Thursday continues to speak. Not through loud declarations, but through symbols, quiet, faithful, eternal. In cathedrals across the world, the day begins with the Chrism Mass. Oils are blessed. Oil for the sick. Oil for the newly baptized, oil for those to be confirmed. Sacred anointings prepared by the Church, echoing the hands of Christ who healed with touch, with presence, with purpose. Then, as evening falls, the Mass of the Lord's Supper begins. Candles are lit. The altar is adorned. And again, bread is broken. Wine is poured. Feet are washed. It's not a reenactment. It's a return. A return to the upper room. A return to the towel, the table, the trembling silence of surrender. A return to a night that didn't just mark history but marked eternity. Because everything Jesus did that night wasn't just meant for the disciples, it was meant for us. The towel still speaks of a love that kneels, that lowers itself, that touches dirt without hesitation. The table still stands, inviting every wandering soul to come, be fed, be known, be healed. The silence still holds, calling us to pause, to listen, to stay awake with him when the world rushes past. And through it all, Holy Thursday reveals itself not as a ritual, but as a blueprint, a way of life, a call to communion, a path of sacrificial love, a posture of servanthood, because Christianity isn't proven in arguments or appearances. It's revealed in how we gather, how we love, how we break ourselves open for others, just as he did. That's why this night is remembered not as an ending, but as a beginning. Holy Thursday is the spark. It lights the fire that will walk through the cross, through the tomb, and into resurrection. But it starts here, with bread, with water, with a kiss, with a yes. And centuries later, those symbols still hold power. In the homes of the broken, in the hands of the weary, in the heart of the church that still aches to live like him, because when you wash someone's feet, when you forgive before they ask, when you offer yourself without fanfare or applause, you're not just remembering him, you're becoming like him. And in that becoming, Holy Thursday lives again, not as history, but as presence. So maybe the question isn't whether the story still matters. Maybe the question is, what part of this night is still echoing in your life? Three things remain from that sacred night: communion, service, sacrifice. Not as concepts, not as traditions, but as a way of being. Jesus didn't just leave behind words. He left a table, so we would always come back to love. He left a towel, so we would remember the power of humility. He left a cross, so we'd never forget what real surrender looks like. And now, more than 2,000 years later, the invitation hasn't changed. Do this in remembrance of me. But maybe he didn't just mean bread and wine. Maybe he meant more. Maybe he meant, love like I loved, serve like I served, give like I gave. Maybe he meant, don't just repeat the ritual. Become the living proof. Because remembrance without response fades. Ceremony without transformation dries up. But a heart that takes the symbols and makes them flesh. That's a life that echoes eternity. So now, we come back to the question that has followed us from the beginning. If you were there that night, where would you be? Would you stay awake? In the garden? Would you kneel with the towel? Would you open your hand when he offered the bread? Would you follow, even when it led to the cross? These aren't questions for guilt. They're invitations for depth, for presence, for surrender. So wherever you are right now, in a church pew, a quiet room, a crowded commute, the upper room is still open, the table is still set, the water still pours, the story still calls. Don't just remember it, live it. Don't just watch, enter in, and if this story stirred something in your heart, like, share, reflect, and above all, love.